And I'm going to go back to the selection tool because now I want to select this track. The background noise was a little too loud, and so I'm going to just lower that. And instead of using the envelope tool, I'm going to use an effect. So there's a whole wide range of effects. There's a few things I want to do, maybe fade in, fade out. But just the overall volume, I'm going to play with the amplify tool. The amplify will let me either boost or reduce the volume for that track. So in this case, I'm just going to choose the amplification. I'm going to go negative 10 decibels. That's a pretty significant drop in volume.
In the air and the birds in the trees, feeling the ground beneath the soles of my feet.
So I'm pretty happy here with the volume of the background noise, but I noticed that the speaker gets quieter a little ways into it. So they started off talking a little bit louder, and then they got quieter once it went underway.
Ground beneath the soles of my feet. I thought of one person.
And so it's really kind of just battling against that background noise. So I don't want to reduce the background noise too far because then we won't be able to hear it. So instead what I'm going to do is I'm going to try to bring up the level of the narration. And so here we can see there's some low lows and some high peaks. And so I'm going to use a tool called the compressor, which is going to kind of even all those out. So all the peaks will be about the same level. I'm just going to go with the presets. I'm not going to change anything. Just click OK. And now you can see those peaks, those high peaks are all pretty much matched. There's a little more uniformity across the middle there as well.
Feeling the ground beneath the soles of my feet, I thought of one person who's introduced me to so many wonderful spots.
And that's quite a bit better. I like the levels quite a bit more, but I can use the amplify tool to give it just a little bit more of a boost. So now that it's a more uniform, bring those peaks up a little bit more.
I thought of one person who's introduced me to so many wonderful spots.
And that is pretty close. That sounds really good. I can still hear the background quite well as the narration. But now I want to kind of tweak the background so that it really matches up to what the narrator is saying. So I want it to end right where the narrator ends. I want it to fade in so it doesn't have a sharp starting point, and I want it to fade out so it doesn't have a sharp ending point. And so I'm going to use those two tools. But one thing I haven't done yet is make sure that it's the length that I want it to. So I have it starting where I want it to start, but I haven't checked to see if it's going to end where I want it to end, right? And that's pretty important. We don't want the background noise to be going on when we've shifted to a different topic. So let's listen to that again.
One person who's introduced me to so many wonderful spots, and he's here in the studio today to talk to me about.
Okay, and so now when we're talking about the person coming into the studio, that's where we know we want that background noise to end. We only want that imagery to be when we're out on the hike. Once we come back to the studio, we're going to get rid of that background sound so that people understand we're back in the studio. So what I'm going to do now is just delete the last part, right? So I'll find the spot where I want to end, select it all, and then just hit the delete key. It's going to get rid of that last bit. And so now, though, I've lost my fade out, so I'm going to go ahead and select the end of it again and do my fade out effect. And so
he's here in the studio today to talk to me about how he started his business, sharing wonderful areas like this, and a little insight.
And that's a pretty perfect ending spot right there. I'm pretty happy with where that ends off. However, there's one other thing that I want to kind of tweak. So I've got three sounds competing here. I've got
the ground beneath the soles of my feet. I thought of one person who's introduced me to.
I've got the background music, the hiking, and the narration, and it's a little bit much. That can, depending upon your personal preferences, that can be fine. But me personally, I want to really just go on this hike. I want this hike to be the only thing that the listener's thinking about. So I'm going to use my envelope tool again on the music, and I'm going to totally fade it down all the way so we can't hear it. And again, you can just kind of play around with that envelope tool and move those dots around, get the right amount of fade in, fade out there.
In the trees, feeling the ground beneath the soles of my feet, I thought of one person who's introduced me to so many wonderful.
And now that has quite a different feel, right? I really like that. No sound, no music at all. Nothing other than person talking and the hike. And it really kind of takes the listener out of the studio onto the trail. And that's kind of what I'm hoping for in that moment. But I want to make sure that there's no music at all. So I'm going to solo that track and then listen to it again and make sure that there's no sound at all. Sure enough, it's perfectly quiet, so I'm pretty happy with that. And so now I'm going to listen to it all again together here. Let's see.
And he's here in the studio today to talk to me about how he started his business, sharing wonderful areas like this, and a little insight into what he does on day to day. Jim, welcome to the podcast.
And so now we have it fading out of the trail, back into the music, back into the studio. And then we need to sync up the interviewee with the interviewer. So I'm going to move the order of my tracks again. I got Jim all the way up here at the top, so Jim can be matched up with the interviewer. And so you can see here when he comes in, there's a bit of a lag from where it's supposed to be. And that's because at the beginning, he started recording a bunch of dead air at the beginning, which is totally fine. That's better than starting halfway in or something. But what I'm going to do is I'm going to sync up these claps. And so I'm just going to use the time shift tool, delete the beginning of his track, line up those two lines there. We can see the clap there is that line, that long vertical line. Just visually line those up. It can be a little bit easier to line those up if I use the zoom in tool. So that's just a little magnifying glass, and I just click on that spot. And you can see here the claps are still a little bit off. So I'm going to go ahead and use the time shift tool. Yeah, there we go. And line those up just as perfectly as I can. And then I'm going to play it back and listen and see how closely those are synced. And that's pretty close. That's pretty perfect, you can kind of play around with this until you get it exactly how you want it to be. But for the most part, you can be a few milliseconds off and it'll sound fine. It's only if you can hear both people through one mic that it might cause some sort of problem. But if they're in two different cities or, two different rooms entirely, being a little bit off isn't going to make a huge difference.
Jim, welcome to the podcast.
Well, thank you for having me. So in this case, I'm pretty happy with that. You have the person coming in at an appropriate amount of time after the interviewer asked them a question. And so I like that. And one other thing, though, to think about is, do I want the background music playing throughout? So here I can say, sure, maybe I want the background music playing forever. Maybe I want to lower it a little bit. Maybe I want to totally fade it out. Maybe the background music is just for this kind of opening intro. And so once I get into the interview itself, then I want to fade the music out so we can just focus on the interview. Again, it's kind of personal preference. I'm going to get rid of this. And so one thing I can do is I could select that and I could delete it. I could just get rid of it entirely if I'm not going to use it again. There's not really there's not a lot of drawbacks to that. The only possible problem would be that maybe I want to come back to the music at the end. And so I'm going to just use the envelope tool to just fade it out. And so as Jim is starting to talk, I'm going to slowly fade it out. So when he says, "Thank you for having me," or whatever, the music is just slowly fading out. And so then their discussion starts, and there's no music, there's no trail sounds, there's nothing else other than just quiet studio. And again, you can kind of tweak this as you drag the little dot forward and backward along the timeline. It will change the length of that fade out. One thing you want to pay attention to, again, is making sure that you're listening to it so that it is dead air. And in this case, we don't hear anything.
To the podcast.
Well, thank you for having me. Totally dead. So that's great. And now, obviously, if this was a longer project, a real project, these weren't just sample files, we'd have a much longer interview. But I'd have my intro nailed at this point, and assuming that my two speakers, their levels are right overall, which I can tweak with the amplify. Maybe the interviewee, I'd want to compress all of his audio as well, so I could double click and compress that, amplify it a little bit. But otherwise, that should remain pretty easy. Once their conversation starts, I'm not going to be tweaking all these different things. So at this point, I'm pretty close to just being done. And since I just lowered the volume with the envelope tool of that background track, I can bring up that music again later, maybe in between segments or at the end.